April 1985. Greenwich Village, New York. A disheveled old man in a bathrobe shuffles slowly down Sullivan Street. His hands tremble. His eyes stare into nothing. To the people who pass him, he's just another broken figure drifting through the city's underbelly. But to the agents watching from an unmarked car, he is something else entirely. A ghost, a performance, and possibly the most powerful mob boss in America. His name is Vincent Gigani, and for years, the Federal Bureau of Investigation could not prove it. The story of Vincent Gigani doesn't begin with madness. It begins with discipline. Born in 1928 in the Bronx, Gigani grew up in a world where power was measured in silence, loyalty, and fear. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't loud. Unlike other rising mobsters of his era, Gigani avoided attention. But behind that quiet exterior was a man being shaped by one of the most powerful crime families in American history, the Genovese crime family. At the time, the family was under the shadow of one name, Vito Genovese, a man who believed power should never be visible, only felt. Gigani absorbed that lesson early. He started as a boxer, a legitimate path, clean, structured, but it didn't last. By the early 1950s, he had moved into organized crime, loan sharking, gambling, enforcement. And then came the moment that would define his loyalty. May 1957. Gigani is handed a gun. His target, Frank Costello. At the time, Costello was one of the most powerful mob bosses in America, a man who had survived political scandals, Senate hearings, and internal betrayal. But power invites enemies, and Gigani was chosen to act. Outside Costello's apartment building in Manhattan, Gigani approached him and pulled the trigger. The bullet grazed Costello's head. He survived. Gigani was arrested. But something strange happened. Costello refused to identify him. A silent understanding. A code. Gigani walked free. And from that moment forward, he wasn't just another soldier. He was trusted. The decades that followed were quiet. Too quiet. While other mobsters chased headlines, lavish lifestyles, public trials, media attention, Gigani disappeared into the background. But inside the Genovese family, he was rising. Slowly, carefully, deliberately. By the 1970s, the American mafia was under increasing pressure. The FBI had begun shifting its focus. Wiretaps, surveillance, long-term investigations. They were building cases against the 5 families of New York. The Gambino crime family, the Lucchese crime family, the Colombo crime family, the Bonanno crime family, and the Genovese family. But there was a problem. The Genovese family didn't operate like the others. There were no flashy bosses, no public power plays. It was structured like a shadow government. And at the center of that structure was Gigani. By the early 1980s, he had become the true boss of the Genovese family. But officially, he wasn't. Instead, the family used what investigators would later call a front boss system. A decoy, someone to take the attention, someone to absorb the risk, while the real power remained hidden. And that's where Gigani became untouchable. To the outside world, he was mentally unstable. He wandered the streets in a bathrobe. He talked to himself. He mumbled incoherently. Sometimes, he would urinate in public. Neighbors described him as harmless, broken, lost. But FBI agents watching him saw something else. Precision. Every move was controlled. Every appearance calculated. It was an act, and a brilliant one. Because under U.S. law, a defendant deemed mentally unfit could not stand trial. Gigani weaponized that. For years. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the Genovese family continued to dominate. Their operations were vast. Labor unions, construction rackets, illegal gambling, loan sharking. They infiltrated legitimate industries, especially through unions tied to New York's construction industry. Concrete, skyscrapers, infrastructure, billions of dollars flowing through projects quietly taxed by organized crime. And unlike other families, the Genovese leadership stayed invisible. No public meetings, no large gatherings. Orders were passed through layers of insulation. Captains spoke to soldiers. Messengers relayed instructions. And at the top, Giuliani rarely spoke directly to anyone outside his inner circle. It was nearly impossible to build a case. By the mid-1980s, the FBI launched one of its most ambitious operations, a coordinated effort to dismantle the leadership of the American Mafia. It would later become known as the Commission Case. Using wiretaps and informants, federal prosecutors targeted the heads of the 5 families. Bosses were indicted. Trials followed. Convictions were secured. The Mafia, for the first time, was on the defensive. But one name was missing: Vincent Giuliani. Agents knew he was the real power behind the Genovese family. They had surveillance. They had patterns. But they didn't have proof. And without proof, they had nothing. Inside FBI offices, frustration grew. Agents watched him for hours, days, years. They recorded his movements. They analyzed his behavior. But every time they got close, the act returned. Giuliani would shuffle down the street, muttering, disoriented, untouchable. One agent reportedly said, "He's playing us." And he was right. What made Giuliani different wasn't just his caution. It was his philosophy. He believed visibility was weakness. Power should never be seen, only felt. While other bosses held court in social clubs and restaurants, Giuliani avoided exposure entirely. He didn't sit at tables surrounded by captains. He didn't give speeches. He didn't make appearances. He ruled through whispers and fear. But the FBI wasn't done. They began shifting strategy. If they couldn't get Giuliani directly, they would go after everyone around him. Associates, capos, messengers, anyone who could connect the chain. And slowly, cracks began to form. Because even the most disciplined organization cannot control everyone. Some men talked, some flipped, and some made mistakes. By the late 1980s, the pressure was building. The Genovese family remained powerful, but the walls were closing in. Wiretaps became more advanced, informants became more valuable, and prosecutors became more aggressive. Still, Giuliani remained free. Still, the act continued. Still, the FBI could not break the network. What they didn't realize yet was that the very thing protecting Giuliani, his silence, his secrecy, his performance, would eventually become the key to bringing him down. But not before years of deception, years of frustration, and a battle between one of the most disciplined crime bosses in history and a federal agency determined to expose him. Because behind the bathrobe, behind the whispers, behind the madness, was a system designed to survive anything. Even the FBI, New York City, inside a dimly lit federal office, surveillance tapes spin endlessly. Voices, static, fragments of conversations. Agents lean over transcripts, circling names, marking patterns. They know the structure. They know the hierarchy. But they still don't have the one thing they need: proof that Vincent Giuliani is in control. The Genovese family had become something the FBI rarely encountered. Not chaotic, not reckless, but methodical, disciplined, almost corporate in its design. Orders didn't travel directly. They moved through buffers, layers of insulation. Capo regimes receive instructions through intermediaries. Associates passed messages without ever knowing their origin. Giuliani rarely spoke in person, and when he did, it was never where the FBI expected. Meetings took place in unusual locations. Not restaurants, not clubs, but on quiet streets, parked cars, public sidewalks, brief conversations, then silence. Agents call them walk-in talks. 2 men walking side by side. No eye contact, no names spoken, just coded language. Then they disappeared. The FBI tried everything: physical surveillance, wiretaps, undercover informants. But Giuliani had built something nearly impenetrable, because he understood one simple truth: the less you say, the less they can prove. Meanwhile, the mafia itself was changing. The convictions from the Commission case had shaken the foundations of organized crime in New York. Bosses from multiple families were serving long sentences. Leadership structures were collapsing. Power vacuums were forming, but not in the Genovese family. There, stability remained, because Giuliani had already adapted, long before the FBI refined its tactics. Unlike bosses such as John Gotti, who embraced media attention and public visibility, Gigani moved in the opposite direction. Gotti wore tailored suits. Gigani wore bathrobe. Gotti spoke to crowds. Gigani spoke to no one. Gotti became a headline. Gigante became invisible. And that invisibility made him dangerous. But even the most carefully constructed systems have weaknesses. And for Gigante, that weakness came from within. Loyalty is never absolute. Late 1980s, federal prosecutors begin building a new approach. If Gigante won't speak, they'll find someone who will. And that's when they start focusing on members of his inner circle. Men who've been close to him for years. Men who understood how the system worked. Men who knew the truth behind the act. One of those men was Vincent Caffaro, a high-ranking captain, trusted, respected, and deeply embedded in the family's operations. For years, Caffaro had operated within Gigante's structure. He understood the coded conversations, the indirect orders, the careful distance Gigante maintained from criminal acts. But pressure changes things, and the FBI knew how to apply it. Indictments began stacking up. Racketeering charges, extortion, labor corruption, each case built on the last. Each charge tightening the noose. And eventually, Caffaro made a decision. He flipped. Inside a federal building, Caffaro began to talk. Quietly, carefully, but clearly. He confirmed what the FBI had suspected for years. Gigante was not mentally ill. He was acting. The bathrobe, the mumbling, the wandering. It was all performance. A shield, a calculated legal defense. For investigators, it was a breakthrough. But it wasn't enough. Because testimony alone wouldn't secure a conviction. They needed corroboration. They needed recordings. They needed evidence that could survive in court. So the FBI pushed further. More wiretaps, more surveillance, more pressure on associates. And slowly, the silence began to crack. Early 1990s, a series of covert recordings begins to paint a clearer picture. Conversations between captains, discussions of orders, references to the boss, but always indirect, always cautious. Gigante's name is rarely spoken, and when it is, it's vague, almost symbolic. At the same time, Gigante continues his public performance. Neighbors still see him wandering the streets, still mumbling, still lost. Doctors are brought in. Psychological evaluations are conducted. And for years, the defense holds. Gigante is declared unfit to stand trial. Case delayed. Again and again. Inside the FBI, frustration turns into obsession. Because they now know the truth. But knowing isn't proving. And proving is everything. Then comes another turning point. Federal prosecutors secure a major indictment against members of the Genovese family. Racketeering, murder conspiracies, extortion, and this time, Gigante is named. The case begins to build momentum. Witnesses come forward. Former associates testify. They describe the structure, the insulation, the coded system of communication, and most importantly, they describe Gigante as the boss. But the defense fights back. Hard. Gigante's lawyers present medical records, psychiatric evaluations, testimony from doctors. They argue that he is mentally incompetent, that he cannot understand the charges against him, that he cannot assist in his own defense. The courtroom becomes a battleground, not just of evidence, but of perception. Is Vincent Gigante a criminal mastermind or a broken man? Outside the courthouse, the image remains the same. The bathrobe, the slow walk, the vacant stare. Cameras capture it all. And for the public, doubt begins to creep in. Inside the FBI, agents watch those same images. But they see something different. Control, timing, consistency. Because madness is unpredictable. But Gigante is not. Then prosecutors make a critical move. They begin introducing evidence of Gigante's private behavior. Moments when he believed he wasn't being watched. Conversations where his speech is clear, focused, coherent. The contrast is undeniable. Publicly, confusion. Privately, precision. And piece by piece, the illusion begins to break. But Gigante is still fighting, still delaying, still hiding behind the persona he perfected over decades. because he understands something most criminals don't. Trials aren't just about facts. They're about belief. And if the jury believes he is mentally ill, he walks. For years, the case drags on. Legal battles, medical reviews, delays, appeals. The system itself becomes part of the struggle. And for a moment, it looks like Gigante might outlast it. But time is not on his side, because the more the FBI digs, the more they uncover. And the more they uncover, the harder it becomes to maintain the illusion. Behind closed doors, the Genovese family is changing. The pressure is affecting operations. Leadership is shifting. Trust is eroding. Because when the boss is under investigation, everyone feels it. And in that tension, mistakes happen. Small ones at first, then bigger ones. And each mistake brings the FBI one step closer. By the mid-1990s, the case is no longer about suspicion. It's about proof. And for the first time in years, Vincent Gigante is no longer untouchable. The performance is cracking. The silence is breaking. And the system he built is beginning to turn against him. Because even the most disciplined empire cannot survive forever. Not when the truth is finally catching up. July 25th, 1997. Brooklyn, New York. The courtroom is silent. No whispers, no movement. At the defense table sits a frail old man in a sweater, head slightly lowered, eyes distant. To anyone walking in, he still looks lost, still looks broken, still looks exactly like the man who wandered the streets in a bathrobe for decades. But this time, no one in the room believes it anymore. Because after years of deception, delay, and denial, the truth about Vincent Gigante is finally on record. The prosecution had spent nearly a decade building the case. Piece by piece, voice recordings, witness testimony, surveillance logs, and most importantly, the words of insiders, men who had once sworn loyalty to the Genovese family, men who now sat under oath. Among them was Vincent Caffaro. Calm, measured, he described the structure, the insulation, the coded system of communication. But more than anything, he described the act. He wasn't crazy, Caffaro testified. He was pretending. The courtroom absorbed it quietly, because by now, the evidence had become overwhelming. Recordings revealed Gigante speaking clearly in private settings, discussing business, giving instructions, operating with the precision of a man fully aware of everything around him. The illusion that had protected him for decades was gone. The jury deliberated. Not for long. The verdict came back. Guilty. Racketeering. Conspiracy. Multiple counts tied to organized crime operations. The invisible boss had been seen. For the Federal Bureau of Investigation, it was a defining victory. Not just because they had convicted a powerful mob boss, but because they had dismantled one of the most sophisticated defensive strategies ever used in organized crime. Gigante hadn't relied on violence to stay free. He relied on perception. And for years, it worked. But the story didn't end with a conviction. Because even after being found guilty, Gigante continued the act, still claiming mental illness, still presenting himself as detached from reality. Then, in 2003, something changed. Inside a federal courtroom, under mounting legal pressure, Gigante made a decision. A rare one. He spoke plainly, and for the first time in decades, he admitted the truth. He pleaded guilty to obstruction of justice. And in doing so, he acknowledged what the FBI had argued all along. The madness was an act, a deliberate performance designed to avoid prosecution. It was one of the most extraordinary admissions in organized crime history, not just because of what he confessed, but because of how long he had maintained the lie. Nearly 30 years. By then, the damage to the Genovese family was already done. The leadership structure had shifted, power had redistributed, and the tight, disciplined system Gigante had built was beginning to fracture. Unlike the chaos that followed other mob convictions, the Genovese family didn't collapse overnight. Their structure was too strong, too deeply embedded. But something fundamental had changed. The illusion of invincibility was gone. Because if Gigante could fall, Anyone could. Behind the scenes, new leadership emerged. Figures like Laborio Bellomo began to take more prominent roles. Younger, more cautious, but operating in a very different environment. The FBI had evolved. Their methods had improved. Wiretaps were more advanced. Informants were more protected. And the legal system had become more aggressive in prosecuting organized crime. The era that Gigani dominated, an era of silence and insulation, was coming to an end. October 2005, Springfield, Missouri. Inside a federal medical center, Vincent Gigani's life quietly comes to an end. No headlines, no spectacle, just a final entry in a long, complex history. He dies at 77 years old. A man who spent decades controlling one of the most powerful crime families in America. While convincing the world, he was barely aware of it. But his story leaves behind more than just a criminal legacy. It leaves behind a question. How did he manage it for so long? The answer lies not in violence, but in discipline. Gigani understood something that many mob bosses ignored. Attention is dangerous. Visibility is weakness. And the more people see, the more they can prove. So he became invisible, not by hiding, but by transforming into something no one would suspect. A man too broken to lead, too unstable to control anything. And for years, the system believed it. The FBI watched him, followed him, recorded him, but they hesitated because the law required certainty. And Gigani gave them doubt. That doubt became his shield, and that shield delayed justice for decades. But in the end, even the most carefully constructed illusion cannot survive forever. Because organized crime, no matter how disciplined, no matter how secretive, always leaves a trace, a conversation, a witness, a mistake. And once that trace is found, the silence breaks. Vincent Gigani built an empire on invisibility. He ruled through whispers. He avoided the spotlight. He turned weakness into protection. But the rules of that world never change. Power invites scrutiny. Secrecy invites suspicion. And time exposes everything. In the end, Gigani didn't fall because he was careless. He fell because the system finally caught up. And when it did, the man who had spent a lifetime pretending to be invisible had nowhere left to hide. Because in organized crime, there are no perfect disguises, only temporary ones. And eventually, every mask comes off,